Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this module, we're going to look at how we can build Angular-based singular page apps, or SPAs, using the Microsoft Graph. In this first section, we're going to focus on an introduction to the Microsoft Graph API. Then we're going to focus on the SDKs and code samples and getting started, along with a few resources. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, one of the concepts we have with Azure AD, and it comes into play with the Microsoft Graph, but it really is an Azure AD thing, and that's called the Common Consent Framework. So what happens is that if you think about permissions and being able to gain access to some service, you really have like a triangle of things that you need. We have the permission, we have the user or the application, and you have the resource that you're trying to talk to. So the resource is the Microsoft Graph, the user and the application, and then you also have the permission. So the user needs to have the permission to the resource to be able to talk to it. Well, the first time the user goes to log in to Azure AD to obtain an access token to talk to the graph, Azure AD is going to look and see, has this user granted this application access to the Microsoft Graph? And specifically, has it granted access to with these permissions? And so the way that this works is that if the user has not gone through this process yet, then the Common Consent Framework kind of kicks in. And after they log in, you'll see a dialog that looks a little bit like what you see there on the right of the slide. What this is saying is that effectively behind the scenes, it's saying you've never granted this permission to this endpoint with this application. So do you now grant that permission? And so what this is doing here, this is called the delegated consent. What this is doing is this is me granting a specific application. So in this case here, it says the publisher's website, what's the name of the app? I'm going to grant this permission to the Microsoft Graph. Or in this case specifically, is I'm just granting it to Azure AD. So reading directory data and signing me in and reading my profile. If I was talking to, say, my files or to my mail, it would have other permissions that were listed there as well. This is like an end user consent. I also have the ability to grant admin consent. And what that means is that is me as a tenant administrator granting these permissions by this application to a resource on behalf of everybody in my organization. That's a much more widespread permission that I'm granting, and it's not always required, but it is required at some point. So it's just an option that's available to you. Now, with the Graph, we do have two ways that we can authenticate, or with Azure AD, there's two ways we can authenticate, and the Graph supports both of them. Now, one way you can do is Azure AD only. And what this is that this says that you're only going to be using a work or school account to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph or to Azure AD, and then use that to go talk to that access token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. The other option is you can use converged auth, which is Azure AD and or Microsoft accounts. And in this case here, what's nice about this is that depending on how I log in, I use the exact same code in the Microsoft Graph, the same endpoints, the same SDKs to get my files either in OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business. And I just use OneDrive as an example. The same is true for calendar and contacts and email inside of Outlook.com or in Exchange in Office 365. But the nice thing about this is that the data that you're going to go fetch is all dependent based on the login of the user that actually logged in. So I don't have to specify any special code or any special APIs or endpoints to get data for consumer accounts or for business accounts. Now, again, with the SharePoint framework, this doesn't really apply because we're only going to be logging into SharePoint Online using an Azure AD account and not a Microsoft account. Now, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft account and Azure AD accounts. This is something I just kind of mentioned a minute ago, where many apps will let you use either a Microsoft account and a Azure AD account, or I guess it's more of an or. The advantage here is that everything is the exact same. It's just a setting of what you support when you register the app inside of Azure AD. The Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint, single for all data, either business data or consumer data. Now let's talk about creating an Angular SPA web application that's been configured with the Microsoft Authentication library for authentication with Azure AD. To create an Angular-based single-page application, what you're going to do is first create the application with the Angular CLI. So you're not going to use a Visual Studio-based wizard for doing this. You're going to do everything with the Angular CLI. As the Angular CLI uses the latest version of Angular, and we're also going to be able to leverage all the tools that the CLI provides us for doing development and running a local web server. You're also going to need to install some additional packages. So you're going to need to install packages such as Bootstrap, ng Bootstrap, that's just for some UI stuff, Angular Font Awesome, Moment for date formatting, the MSAL Angular library or package, RxJS Compat, and the Microsoft Graph client. Then you're going to go build the application. So you're going to design the application by creating the stub.ui view controllers for your application. So let's see how to do this in action in a demo. Now, in this first demo, we're going to just simply create the single page application, but we're going to focus mostly on an application that has already been created. And the reason for that is mostly for the interest of time with the screencast and because dependencies can change. And so some of the version numbers may change or will likely change after we have recorded this screencast. And so what we want to do is, if you want to see the step-by-step process of creating this application and do it yourself and try it out for yourself, we maintain a hands-on lab that is in the module that's associated with this screencast. So refer to that when you want to take a look at how to create this application in a very step-by-step process. We're not going to run through that inside of this screencast. Again, that's available to us as well as the final code sample for the demo. That's all available in the module that's associated with this screencast. Okay, in this demo, we're going to take a look at an Angular-based application that I've created using the Angular CLI. And I've already created it ahead of time to save a little bit of time here. As I described or mentioned earlier, this module, in this screencast, we're not building the application from scratch. Instead, we're looking at the application that we've created and looking at all the pieces to it. What we are going to focus on, though, is how this thing works. If you want to see the final result, or if you want to run through a hands-on lab that walks you through creating the application from scratch, if you refer to the module that is associated with this screencast, there is a demo folder that contains all of the built demos, and there is a hands-on lab that walks through the details of creating the application. So I'd recommend you take a look at that to see how the application works. So what we did is we ran the Angular CLI to create the application. And if I look at the package.json file here, you'll notice a few other things that we've added. For example, I've added things like Bootstrap. I've added things like Font Awesome, which would be right here, all the Font Awesome stuff that you see right in here. I've also added in Moment, Moment's time zone as well. There's an ng Bootstrap as well for working with Bootstrap and Angular apps. And I've also installed something called the Azure MSAL Angular library, which is going to be a tool that we can use to authenticate with Azure Active Directory. And then we also have the Microsoft JavaScript SDK as well. So after creating the default application, what have I done? So I then went in to the styles and I imported the Bootstrap library and added in a couple other CSS classes here to my application. And then in the main part of my application in app.module.ts, I added in a few references here for like the module. I added in Font Awesome. I added in more stuff for Font Awesome that you see all listed here. But really it's just all of this stuff is what I listed. I also then added in the Font Awesome imports here into our library for being able to use things like the external link alt and the circle as well that you see I imported from right up here. Then what we did is inside of the module declaration, what I've done here is I added in a bunch of imports. So I imported things like the browser module, the app routing module, the NGB module, which is for NG Bootstrap, and Font Awesome. And then I went through and I created a nav bar. So if I take a look at the nav bar component that we created here, you can see here that this nav bar component is being listed as an app nav bar. That's how we're going to use it in our application. And then I just wrote out some code here to implement this. So we have our on init, we have the top to toggle it, the nav bar itself to show it or not show it. There's a sign in button and there's also a sign out button as well. If I look at the actual template for it, this is just a bunch of HTML that implements our nav bar with using the Font Awesome icons as well. Now we also have a home page for our application that we created. That's our home. So if I look at home.component.ts, here what this one does is we have our on init that says we're not authenticated initially and our user is set to nothing. And then we have a sign in button that we're going to use. Now by default, when we click sign in, it's going to be hard coded to automatically sign the user in and hard code to use this user here. So we're going to have to add logic to that in a future demo to actually log them in using Azure AD and the Microsoft Authentication library. And then there's a template to go along with this as well. Finally, we also have an alert. So I have this alert component that I've created, and all this alert component does is it's created a service. I'm not going to go through the details of looking at the Angular service. You can go review that if you're interested. But that just essentially gives us a way to be able to put little notifications inside of the application. Now, let's take a look at the routing for our application. So here in my routing, I think it's in the routing module here. Here we have in our routing is I've defined a path for our home component right here. So when I don't show up anywhere, it's going to navigate to my home component. And to look at what that component or what the app component looks like, you can see here that I've got my nav bar, the role is main, class is container, and then here are my alerts are going to show up, and then my router outlet, so where things are going to be rendered. So to get this thing up and running, let's go ahead and let's run the app. So I'm going to do that by saying ng-serve-open, which will launch the browser. So here is our Angular application. And if I just look at it, see nothing's going on. If I click here to sign in, it has it hard-coded to log me in as Adele Vance. So you've seen just the basics of the application. We just done a quick little tour of what the default application looks like. So you've now seen that. So now the next step is to start talking about authentication and extending the application to handle the Microsoft authentication. So with that, let's jump back over to our slides. In this section, we're going to look at adding authentication to our Angular SPA with the Microsoft Graph. So specifically, we're going to look at the registration of our application using the Azure AD portal. We're going to then show you how to create and configure your credentials and how to select the type of the application and then how to configure all of your permissions. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use the Azure AD admin portal to configure and create your application. If you have an Azure subscription, you can use the Azure portal to do that. But if you don't have an Azure subscription, you can log in using aad.portal.azure.com. And that's going to allow you to log in either with an Azure AD account or a Microsoft account to manage app registrations. From this portal, you'll be able to create web applications, native applications, including mobile, and single page applications as well. You can obtain an application ID and a secret for use in a custom code solution, define scopes and permissions ahead of time, but it also supports defining scopes and permissions at runtime, so having the actual request for the scopes be defined when the application's running instead of having to grant them ahead of time. So how do you go about creating an app inside the Azure AD portal? So what you're going to do is you're going to go first to the app registration page and you're going to create a new application. So in this case here, we're going to call ours the Angular Graph tutorial. Once you do that, you're also going to specify a redirect URL. So where are they going to be redirected to? So you're going to create a new application in the app registration section of the Azure AD portal. And then that's going to give you a unique ID for your application. And then you can optionally add any permissions to your application. Now, this is optional because this is defined as, or this is a static consent model, but you can add in a dynamic consent model where you define the permissions or you request the permissions once the application has been created. So in this demo, we're going to see how to create the application and then how to modify our Angular application to set up the authentication with the Microsoft Authentication library. All right, in this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to create a Azure AD application for use inside of a client-side application, a single-page app in a web framework. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my, I've already gone ahead and logged in to the Azure AD portal by just going to aadportal.azure.com. So I go to Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to go to App Registrations to create a new application. So I'm going to create one, create a new registration, and this is going to be called my Graph Tutorial. Right? And then I'm going to specify that I want any account to be able to use this. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to specify the redirect URI of where I want my user to go back to. So in this case, I'm going to choose http/localhost. And then I'm probably going to want to put a port on the end of this. And it really is going to depend on the port that I want to use for the tooling that I use. So for example, if I'm using building a React-based application using the Create React app utility that's very common with React, it has a default URL of 3000, or port of 3000 where it spins up its local web server. If you're doing Angular, then it uses the port of 4200. So you can have a couple different ports that you can end up using here. I'm going to specify 3000 on this one, and I'm going to actually go add in another one in just a minute for 4200. So I can use this in any kind of a client-side app. So I've got one defined here, and then I'm going to add in another one over here for HTTP localhost 4200. Okay, and then we will just save that change. Now that that's done, let's go back to the overview. And what I want to do is I want to make sure I grab this application ID. I'm going to need that later, so I'm going to copy it, and we're just going to paste it off in somewhere else for just a moment. Now the next thing I need to do under authentication is I need to configure this app for client-side, supporting client-side auth, or specifically something called the implicit flow, which means I don't have to pass a secret along, but I will support the implicit grant. It allows us to do things like for our single-page applications. So I'm going to say I want to use access tokens and ID tokens. Those are both things that can be returned, and then I will save my changes. And that's everything I need to do to get my app all configured and set up. So now let's switch over to our application and let's go configure it to use this service or this new app that we just created. Okay, now that we've created our Azure AD application, in this next section, we're going to extend the application from the previous exercise or the previous demo that we looked at. We're going to see what I've done to support authentication with Azure AD, which is required to obtain the necessary OAuth tokens to call the Microsoft Graph. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this OAuth.ts file, and I need to update it to use the ID of the Azure AD app that we just created in the last section in the Azure AD admin portals we talked about. Now, if I come over here and I look at the module itself under app module, right, I want you to notice a couple of things we've done. I've added in an import here statement for my MSAL module, and I'm importing in that OAuth setting that we just looked at a moment ago. And in my import statements here, what you'll see is I'm adding in the MSAL module. I'm adding it to the root, and I'm specifying the client ID equal to the app ID for the setting that we just set up here. Now I've also created a new file here called user.ts, which is just a model for a new user object. And then I've also created in a new authentication service. So let's just look at this auth service for a moment. So in this auth service, the important part here is if I scroll down to the, let's see, in the constructor, notice here in the constructor that we're having the authentication service, the MSAL service, and the alert service. Those are two things that will be injected into this service when this service gets initialized. And I'm going to go set the authentication state for the auth service equal to if I have a user or not. And then I'm also going to call get user to go fetch the user as well if I am currently authenticated. Now, this service also has a sign in and a sign out button. So the sign in button, what he's going to do is he's going to call the MSAL service and trigger the login prompt. And I'm going to pass in all of the scopes that I want. Now, once I've logged in, I'm going to get a result back. And here I can set the authenticated state, and I'm going to go fetch the current user information. We'll see where that is in just a moment. Sign out does kind of the inverse of all of that. And then when I came over here and I said that I wanted to log in and I called this.getUser, well, if you look at getUser here, this getUser is going to have to create a new instance of the Microsoft Graph. And I'm doing that by calling the init method. So that init method, what that's going to do is I pass in the auth provider property or function that simply says that once this is called, he's going to go fetch an access token and return that back. That's going to give me my graph client, which is what I'm going to be able to use to go fetch the current user. And if you see up here, this is getting the access token. I'm simply going to call the MSAL service.acquire token silently to go fetch information about the current user. Then I made some changes to the navbar and the navbar component. And so in here in the navbar component, what I'm doing is I'm going to, in the sign in, I'm simply going to change it to use our sign in service, our sign in method, and our sign out method as well. And you can see here I'm also using the dependency injection capabilities that Angular provides out of the box to have our authenticated service get injected inside of our application. And then inside of our home component as well, I've also done a little bit of work here to import the auth service, have that be something that will be dynamically injected into our application. And then I'm simply going to have the sign in button as well on our method or component to have the sign in piece as well. Now I have the same kind of changes I end up making here for the navbar. I have to do some stuff inside the component to bind to the sign in button inside of our app. But that is, let's see, scroll over here. So there we go. Our button is going to have the sign in button. And I didn't show you that for the navbar, but in the navbar, our authentication piece is right here as well. For sign in, I'm also adding in, binding to the click event, the sign in method. So let's see this in action. So I'll do that by saying ng-serve --open. And so if you recall, the last time we ran this, when I click sign in, it was hard coded to log in as Adele Vance, and now it should not be logging in as Adele Vance. Now it'll log in as the current user. So now let's go ahead and let's sign in. So I'll click here to sign in, and we will choose the account we've been working with. And let me grab my password. And sure enough, we are. We are now logged in as the administrator, and I can see their name, email address is coming along just fine, exactly what we would expect. So this is cool. So at this point, the application has an access token, which is sent to the authorization header of all the API calls. This token, this is the token that allows the app to access the Microsoft Graph on the user's behalf. So the token's gonna be short-lived, and it's gonna expire an hour after it's been issued, but because the app is using the MSAL library, I don't have to implement any token storage or refresh logic because the MSAL service is caching the token in the browser storage, and it's going to be using the method of acquire token silent to first check if the cache token is not expired, and if it's not, it's going to give it back to me. If it is expired or if it's about to expire, it will make a silent request to obtain a new version of the token using the refresh token. So the last step is to look and see how we can integrate more Microsoft Graph data inside of our application. So let's see that in the next section. In this section, we're going to continue building Angular spas with the Microsoft Graph, but we're going to focus on incorporating the Microsoft Graph into your Angular web application. We're first going to look at the NPM packages you're going to need to install in order for this to work, how to authenticate with Azure AD, and then how to create an instance of the Graph service and issue the requests and process the results. So the first thing you need to do is you're going to need to install the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK. This isn't exactly required. You can always call the REST API if you want to, but if you want to use the JavaScript SDK for a more fluent API, you're more than welcome to do that. The easiest way to do that is either if you're using NPM, you can use the Microsoft Graph at Microsoft/Microsoft-Graph-Client library. In this case here, you can see I'm installing a specific version 1.6. You can also install it via NuGet if you were using NuGet. So you could use the Microsoft.graph package, and that's also going to include the core package as well for this as well. That's more on the server side example if you were doing that. The first step you're going to need to do is implement some code that's going to obtain an access token using the Microsoft Authentication library. So you first obtain an access token from Azure AD by authenticating. So I'm doing this here using the JavaScript SDK for MSAL. And so here I have a method called getAccessToken, and I'm doing that by calling the MSAL service.acquireToken silently. And I'm going to pass in all of the scopes or all the permissions that I'm looking for. Now, once I get that result that's going to come back, I then am going to be able to take that result and return it back. All right. So in this case here, I'm showing you how to actually add that to an alert service, and just show that the token has been acquired. Now, how do I call the Microsoft Graph and get events or from my calendar? I'm just going to use the Graph client. So I'm going to call this.graph client, and for the API, I'm going to point to the endpoint /me/events. Of course, there are other options I could do with this. I could say just me and then events. And then in the select statement, I'm going to pass the properties I want to get. The order by statement, I'm going to pass those properties as well. And then I'm going to issue my HTTP GET and return back the results that I requested. So what's the experience look like for this? Well, the user is going to first be prompted to sign in and then be prompted for consent. And this is only going to happen if the was not already granted by the user, if they didn't already grant access to their data. And then all the data is going to be shown inside of the client. So let's do a quick overview of how this sample works. So when I first go to hit the site, I'm going to first be prompted to go to the Azure AD and log in. So once I log in, it's going to give me back an access token. And then Angular is going to use that access token, passing it to the Microsoft Graph client. The JavaScript client is then going to call the REST API on my behalf to get all of my calendar items, and then I'm going to get those back and return those and render those out on the screen. Now, how does this whole thing work? Once the access token is required or acquired, your application is going to continue to call the Graph API without having to go through the steps to obtain the access token again. Instead, it just caches it locally and it keeps using it. And at some point, the token is going to expire. A refresh token is used to obtain a new access token without requiring the user to sign in again. To understand why the MSAL library is important, it's necessary to understand what it's handling for you. Your code is going to follow a simple pattern to acquire a token silently, and if that fails, acquire it interactively. What I mean by that is that silently is going to try and fetch the token using a refresh token if it already has a token that may have expired. And if it doesn't work and it requires me to interactively log in, then it's going to prompt me to go log in. Your code doesn't need to manage the login pop-up screen, the interaction for obtaining the consent, and it does not also need to manage the lifetime of the token. That MSAL does all that for you. The call to the common/OAuth v2 authorized endpoint is going to pop up a login screen and request a permissions consent, or the common consent framework. It's important to cache the refresh token to a request with a new access token, and the MSAL library is going to do that for you. There's no action for you as the developer to manage the refresh token. You can create a custom cache for persistence, but MSAL is going to manage all of that stuff for you. It is just important to understand, though, what the MSAL library is doing for you. So in this last demo, we're going to see how to pull all of this together, implement the authentication in our code with MSAL, and how to go fetch calendar data inside of our application. Okay, in this last section, we're going to incorporate more of the Microsoft Graph into this application. And again, just as a recap, we are using the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph that you see I've referenced here. So the first thing I've done is I've created this new property here inside of my app called events. So I have my event right here, and this event is just simply a reference for an event object that we would have inside of our application. Now, I want to add a new service that's going to hold all of my graph calls. So I've created a new service here called graphservice.ts. And what this has inside of it is inside of the constructor, it's getting a reference to our authentication service, the Microsoft authentication library service. When this initializes, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new instance of a graph client. And you've seen this before when I did this when I was getting a user information. Here, I'm using the specifying the auth service to go get the access token. And when I get that access token, that's what's being used to create an instance of the Microsoft Graph client. I'm then going to go through and implement a method or create a method called getEvents. And what this is going to do is this is going to create a call to the Microsoft Graph for all of the events for the current user, and then it's using the same $select and $order by or the Fluent API options for these to fetch some information about the current user's events. Now I also went through and I created a new component here called the calendar component. So you can see what the UI looks like for this to render out what the calendar looks like. But in this case here for calendar.component, I am now going to be initializing my graph service as something that's being imported in. So if I look over at my routing, the routing for my module, you now see I have a calendar component that I've created. When I go to /calendar, that's where it's going to be showing up. And then also, then when I look at the component for my my calendar item, if we take a look at this, inside of the initialization method, that is where I'm going to go fetch all of my events. And then once I fetch all those events, I bind them to the public property or the private property of all of these events. And those are going to be bound to my component, and all that data is then going to show up and get rendered out inside of this. So you can see let each event of all of the events be able to write all of these events out. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to come over here to my application and I'll say ng-serve yet again, $open. And so the first step is going to be to authenticate. So I'm going to click here to sign in to go log in. I'll choose my account, and yet again we have to provide the password. And here we're now logged in. Now you see that once we logged in, calendar showed up inside of our navigation bar. So now if I go to the calendar, we can see we're fetching all of the items that have been created for the current user. And notice too, we're still logged in as our MOD administrator or that account that we see listed there. So it's pretty straightforward, as you see, to use the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph to go fetch all this information from the graph and all these events to be able to use them inside of your inside of an Angular-based application. So pretty cool. And so with that, if you're interested in seeing the final solution for this or a exercise in the hands-on lab to build out the entire application, again, refer to the training module that this screencast is associated with and check out both the code downloads that are available for each one of the demos, and you can check out the hands-on lab that walks through the detailed steps for this entire process of creating the application. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, The demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps and screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.